Here at AE 911 Truth. Every month, we're bringing you new presenters from Project Due Diligence, talking about first the World Trade Center 7 first each month, and then followed by the Twin Towers, which we are on this month. And this month's presenter is Seth McVey. He's an engineer with a Bachelor of Science degree from Carroll College, and he has a Master of Science Structural Engineering degree from the University of New Mexico. Currently, he is working as a civil bridge engineer, and he is a dedicated volunteer with Project Due Diligence, helping to educate branches of professional organizations about the World Trade Center evidence. So they're getting all this information that you're going to see tonight. Now, before we get started, I just want to let any engineers out there who may be viewing this, either live or in the archives, I want to let you know that you can get credit for viewing this presentation. All you have to do is go to our continuing professional development page. That's at ae911truth.org/CPD. You provide your information, including your email address, and then there's a very short quiz that you'll take on that page. And you got to get all the questions right. And if you don't, we'll give you another chance at it. But once you complete that quiz, we'll email you a certificate. So definitely get your credit. Check out ae911truth.org/CPD. So with all of that out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Seth. Seth, take it away.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. As Andy stated, my name is Seth McVey, and I'm excited to get into tonight's topic of World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2. This presentation was developed by AE 911 Truth's Project Due Diligence Outreach. At Project Due Diligence, we work with volunteers around the country with the mission of reaching engineering, architectural, and civic organizations with the presentation you are about to hear. If anyone, after listening to tonight's presentation, would like to sign a petition calling for a new investigation into the failure mechanisms of World Trade Center Buildings 1, 2, and 7 on 9/11, I strongly encourage you to do so. You'll become part of a group of over 3,500 professional architect and engineers who have also signed the petition. You can sign the petition at ae911truth.org. If you would like to volunteer and get involved with Project Due Diligence, please feel free to reach out to me or through the AE 911 Truth website. There's a lot of information to go through this evening, and the presentation is expected to last about 45 minutes, and I will leave some time at the end to answer any questions that you guys have. Last week, we discussed the errors and omissions in the official government narrative, which is spearheaded by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, of World Trade Center Building 7. Tonight, we will go through the errors and omissions in the report on Buildings 1 and 2, otherwise known as the Twin Towers. After 9/11, NIST was tasked with evaluating and writing the report on the building collapses. NIST is a branch of the Department of Commerce, so their report is the official narrative of the United States government. Their report on the Twin Towers is approximately 10,000 pages long, and there's much information contained in the report that is just simply incorrect. The report defends the progressive collapse theory, which we briefly discussed last week and can be shown to be an error. As mentioned last week, before 9/11, no steel high-rise building had failed due to fire. So the progressive collapse due to fire of the 3 buildings on 9/11 was, by all accounts, a historic day for structural engineering and demolition experts. So with that being said, let's get into this presentation. Tonight, we're going to be focusing, like I said, on the Twin Towers. Twin Towers were part of the World Trade Center complex, which actually consisted of seven different buildings. Buildings 1 and 2 were the large 110-story tall Twin Towers. And then there were 2, 3, and 4, which were small commercial buildings. And then World Trade 5 and 6. And then World Trade Center Building 7, which we discussed last week as a 47-story high-rise structure. Tonight, to give an overview of this presentation, we're going to get into the background of World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2, including some of their design and what went into their construction that made them unique structures for their time. We're going to discuss the aircraft impacts and damage. We're going to go into the NIST column failure theory and collapse hypothesis. We're going to discuss evidence of core column failure first. We're going to go over the ASCE published progressive collapse theory, which we briefly discussed last week, but we'll get into more details this week. We're going to go through an analysis of that progressive collapse theory and show why it's wrong and the assumptions that Zinetic-Bazant made were incorrect. We're also going to go into the South Tower collapse symmetry anomaly. We're going to discuss other high-rise fires that have occurred throughout the world and show why fires can't bring down a building of this size and shape and structural type. We're going to go through the destruction of evidence, summary of problems with the NIST World Trade Center Tower Report, and deficiency categories in the NIST World Trade Center Reports and ASCE published theories. So let's begin by talking a little bit about the Twin Towers structures. So up until this point, and by this point, I mean the 1973, 1974 time frame when the World Trade Center buildings 1 and 2 were constructed, most high-rise buildings were actually made up of a continuous grade of steel framing, which means that you had symmetric columns and frames and beams and girders going in every direction, which made office floor space kind of compact. You couldn't really expand your area, so there wasn't really an open office floor plan that we see in a lot of buildings today. That the Twin Towers were actually designed as a tube structure, which allowed this open floor plan to become more of a reality in high-rise structures of this type. And you can see in the picture on the right that there was kind of a tube structure which was contained of 47 columns, which were very, very dense in their shape, and then a perimeter columns that you can see around the 4 faces of the structure of 240 columns. There were prefabricated floor assemblies, which included 29-inch deep trusses at 80 inches on center, with 24-inch deep bridging trusses between them running laterally, carrying a 1.5-inch deep steel corrugated floor with a 4-inch thick steel reinforced concrete floor. So each floor contained one of these things, and we'll get into some of the failure mechanisms on these specific elements in a little bit. But this is what made the World Trade Center buildings 1 and 2 so unique for their time, was that they had the tube structure in the middle, which carried all of the elevators of the building. So that I think there were 99 or something like that elevators in each of the towers. And then the actual core columns or the perimeter columns on the outside were designed to take all of the lateral loads. So if you think about it, I think John Schuler, another presenter doing this, he likes to use the example of the Eiffel Tower, which I think is a really good example. So you can kind of see how the Eiffel Tower has this wide base, and if you can picture yourself standing with a wide stance in your legs, it makes it difficult to knock over a structure of this type. So the perimeter columns acted in that similar fashion in holding the lateral loads of any load that would be put laterally on the building. So here's a plan view of the World Trade Center buildings 1 and 2. You can see that they were 207 feet by 207 feet. So each floor was almost an acre. The largest floor span, so on the long side of the core columns, it was 60 feet connecting to the perimeter columns. And then the core itself was approximately 135 feet by 87 feet. Like I stated earlier, the core tubular structure consisted of 47 massive steel core columns and 240 steel perimeter columns. So 60 columns on each side, spaced at approximately 3 to 4, about 4 feet. And so there was a lot of steel going on in these buildings, and which made it very resistant to any type of load that it would experience, which can be seen here. You can see in the top left, because of this tubular shape and the way that it was designed, obviously the bottom floors were more dense than the top floors because they had to carry more gravity load or dead loads. And for you engineers out there, that includes, the members themselves, the concrete, the dead load of the furniture on each floor, and also the live loads that were going to be put on the floors, including people and really just people. I don't think they would have any other type of live load, as no vehicles are going in this building. So you can see here that the bottom columns shown at the top left were very dense steel, 20 inches in height and approximately 45 inches in length, with 3 very thick flanges to hold up the weight. And as you go up in altitude, you can see that the columns lessened in their denseness because they had less load to carry. In addition to the thicknesses varying, there were also different strengths of steel used. So 12 different strengths of steel were actually used in the construction of these 2 structures. And the perimeter columns of the towers to accommodate the wind load and seismic stresses, while keeping the gravity-induced unit stress on both perimeter and core columns on each floor the same. So they utilized 12 different steel strengths so that the floor weights would distribute evenly to the inner tubular columns and to the perimeter columns, so that you wouldn't get warping of floors or anything like that. And so they did account for the wind and seismic loads, as we'll see here in a little bit. So let's get into a little bit about the plane impacts. You can see that the North Tower was hit first, obviously at approximately 8:45 in the morning. Flight 11, American Airlines Flight 11, which was a Boeing 767, crashed into the north face of the North Tower at approximately the 96th floor. And it was going approximately 473 miles per hour. The plane that hit the South Tower hit at approximately the 85th floor at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning. It was also a Boeing 767 airplane going approximately 566 miles per hour. You can see here on the right that the plane impacted the South Tower along the short edge of the tubular structure at an angle, whereas the plane that hit the North Tower pretty much hit the tower straight on, but along the long side of the tubular structure, which is important to consider, which we'll get into here in a second. So you can see that this is the North Tower. So you can see where NIST has claimed, and we agree with the impact location of the plane entering the building. Again, it entered the long side of the tubular structure core, and it was pitched downward at approximately 11 degrees. It hit at the 95th floor, but NIST claims that collapse initiated on the 98th floor. Here's a schematic from showing how the plane entered. You can see here the wing tips shown by the dots in the red, and then the engines with yellow circles right approximately in the middle of the page. On the left side, you see the floor numbers, and at the top, you can see the column numbers. And what's interesting about this is that the way that the structure was built. So you had 3 floors of continuous prefabricated steel columns being bolted together, which is represented by these orange, purple, and various colors that are going vertically. You can see that for 3 floors, a column was continuous, meaning that it was prefabricated that way, delivered to the site, and bolted together to the column beneath it, which is important for construction purposes and for and making sure that the loads are distributed how they need to go. According to the report, the NIST report, the wings are rolled 25 to 30 degrees from the horizontal. So here's a video of Charles Thornton, who's a structural engineer. He was actually part of the FEMA investigation discussing the wind loads and lateral loads that the World Trade Center buildings were intended to take.
The fact that they were designed to resist over 13,000 tons of wind pressure meant that they could not be knocked over. In a remarkably prescient interview given over 15 years ago, Charlie Thornton, now one of the investigators, considered the scenario.
Well, 13,000 tons is a lot of force. People always talk about an airplane crashing into a building. And in 1944 or 45, a plane did crash into the Empire State Building. But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything to the major building. It could affect localized structural elements, could knock out a column, and there could be some damage. But as far as a plane knocking a building over of that type, that would not happen.
Since the Empire State accident had shown that a plane could crash into a New York skyscraper, the designers were forced to consider.
So you heard it from Thornton that these buildings were designed to take 13,000 tons of lateral load, including wind or seismic or an extreme event like a plane crash. So although at the time of the construction of the buildings and the design of the buildings, a Boeing 767 hadn't been created yet. Just the fact that it overcompensated for those lateral loads means that this building could not be knocked down by an airplane impacting it. So the World Trade Center engineer who designed the buildings was by a guy by the name of John Skilling. And Skilling noted that he designed the World Trade Center towers to take a hit from a Boeing 707. And in 1993, he was asked if he had considered plane crashes in his design. He replied, "Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel would dump into the building, but the building structure would still be there." So what that means is that he over-designed these, as we'll see here in a second, with the factors of safety that he used. He way over-designed this structure to take an enormous amount of lateral load, including a very large airplane hitting it at 400, 500 miles an hour. Okay, so the further into the impact of the planes, the robustness of the perimeter frame tube. So this is from NIST actually, saying that the robustness of the perimeter frame tube system and the large size of the buildings helped the towers withstand the impact. The structural system redistributed the loads without collapsing in places of the aircraft impact. So NIST even admits that because of the over design and of the perimeter columns and tubular columns and steel trusses and that were in the building, there was no way, because of the redistribution of loads and redundancy within the structure itself, that this building would have fallen. More and even more crazy is that it wouldn't have fallen within its own footprint at a symmetrical collapse. The towers withstood the initial impact of the aircraft. The buildings had more than 1,000 times the mass of the aircraft. This ability to withstand the initial impact is hardly surprising. So there have been numerous people that have admitted that this building could not have collapsed due to the impact from the planes. Now, what about? So here you can see the redistribution of the loads that's talked about. So once the plane hit, all the gravity loads redistribute down to the outside around the plane and go through other columns and sources. So if you remember your physics class, force follows the path of least resistance. So it's going to go to where it needs to go. Okay, aircraft impact analysis showed the wings were shredded before they hit the central core. So this is a diagram of the North Tower, and you can see that the figure on the left showing that the plane entering the structure, how it was shredding the fuselage. And then on the right, you see a diagram of the plane after all its wings had been shredded because of the complexity of the frame itself. So the columns, the steel trusses just shredded this airplane. So there's no way it could have reached the core columns at going the speed that it did. It was dramatically just demolished by the time it was even inside the building. Okay, so you can see here, this is from the NIST report. These are the rendered views of the impact damage on the North Tower at various floors. You can see the 94th floor, not so much damage. The 95th floor, a little bit more damage. And then the 96th floor, where they say it actually entered the building, has the most damage. The 97th floor, again, not too much damage. But then NIST goes on to claim that at the 98th floor, which they actually don't even include a diagram for, that's where they say collapse initiated. But you can see by just looking at the 97th floor, the impact damage to the 98th floor couldn't have been that much. So why did it fail there? Here's an isometric view of the impact damage done to the steel frame of the structure. You can see the 98th floor called out here. Not too much damage on the 98th floor. If you would think that this thing would have failed from anywhere, it would have been the 96th floor where it actually hit. Okay, jet fuel effects. Like it stated earlier, or as John Skilling stated earlier in that quote that I gave you guys, he was mostly concerned with jet fuel dumping into the building and causing issues that way. But in NIST report, they did a sensitivity test on the jet fuel effects at various floors. You can see here in the diagram the amount of fuel that was left into each floor. You could see on the 98th floor where they had collapse initiation happening, there was only 240 gallons of jet fuel supposedly in there. However, they also state that in their sensitivity study of the jet fuel, the amount of fuel spilled in the simulation only influenced the results of the first few minutes. The long-term behavior of the simulated fires was unaffected. So essentially what that's saying is that the long-term effect of jet fuel burning and melting the steel was not there. The jet fuel burned up, aerosolized, and upon impact, which was the explosions that you see supposedly in when the planes hit the towers, but most of the jet fuel was actually burned up in that first few seconds, and it wouldn't have caused melting of steel or catastrophic behavior like we witnessed. So this is a summary of why the aircraft impact and jet fuel would not have caused the collapse. The wings would not have made it to the central core, which is where the jet fuel was kept. So there was no fuel dumping down the elevator shafts or anything like that. They were shredded upon impact. And like we saw in the diagrams, only the fuselage, if the fuselage made it to the core columns, would have affected the core columns. Most of the jet fuel was aerosolized on impact, again, talking about the explosions, with much of it remaining outside the building. The fuel, which did not enter the building, burned up within minutes due to the fires. The redundant steel frame redistributes load, so the aircraft impact could not have caused that due to the redundancy of the structure itself. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the factor of safety that John Skilling used to design these against vertical collapse for the perimeter columns was 5-to-1. So that means that each perimeter column was designed to take 500% of the expected load it was to carry. And then for the central core columns, they were expected to carry, or they were designed to take 300% of the loads they were expected to experience. This is far too high for the impact damage to approximately 20% of the columns to have caused collapse. And it should be noted that here also 20% of the columns in 5 floors, like these planes hit up at the top of the buildings. So you still had 90 plus floors of non-damaged columns to resist the load and to provide redundancy. So for the towers to fall as they did, it just doesn't make any sense. So getting into the NIST column failure theory. So the NIST theory, which, like I stated at the beginning of this presentation, is the official United States government theory. And this is what they say. Is that the exterior columns were pulled inward by heating and sagging of the floor trusses, causing them to buckle and initiate the global collapse. The report claims this happened on the south face of the North Tower, and the east face of the South Tower. So as the fires burned, it heated up these steel frames and started to pull on the perimeter columns, causing global collapse. Sagging in detailed truss model. So after the members buckled, the truss pulled the exterior columns in. So this is from NIST. This is what they claim. After web members buckled, the truss pulled the exterior columns in. The tension force ranged from 19 to 14 kips per column in this model at the exterior column. So you can see as the temperature increased, it started to pull in the columns on the perimeter, these trusses. And you can see in the upper figure here, which was a finite element analysis done by NIST, that there was a buckling of web members. So they had vertical displacement and sagging in these trusses, which they claim pulled on the perimeter columns between 19 and 14 kips. This is the ASCE model of the 96th floor from NIST of World Trade Center Building 1. ASCE is a commercial finite element software, which is used for modeling complex structures, including buildings and bridges and anything else that you want to do. But you can see here that they have their the floor trusses, and then they have the bridging trusses in between. You see your perimeter columns here. What's important to note about this is that the NIST global model of this floor could not produce an inward force from sagging floor trusses, which would pull the columns inward. So that 9 to 14 kips that they claim was able to pull these columns inward, leaving the south and east faces of the north and south towers, respectively, unsupported for that whole floor. There's just no evidence to support that. However, to produce that inward bowing of the columns that they claimed happened due to the sagging floor trusses, an artificial 5,000-pound lateral load was applied to each truss to column connection at each story of the impact zone. So for the 5 floors that they claimed there was damage at, from the 98th to the 93rd floor, they applied 5,000 pounds of lateral force inward to each column truss connection in order to get it to buckle the way that they did. This means that approximately 750 kips, or 750,000 pounds of artificial force, was applied laterally to the structure that was not there. This is an artificial force. It's not a real force. There's no reality behind it. They needed this to apply this force in order to get the model to react the way that they said it would. So they're just pulling stuff out of their you-know-whats. Again, this was applied to over 5 stories for a total of 750,000 pounds of artificial force that the buildings did not experience. Okay, to cause this inward bowing, so that 750,000 pounds, in order to get this bowing that's shown on the screen here with a maximum deflection of 43 inches, we're looking at the face of the building here. They needed to apply that 750,000 pounds, which was not there again. So without that, the deflection that they claimed happened, which was 43 inches, to get those columns to buckle and fail, is not real. It's crazy. Okay. Based on this photo, at 10:22, the measurements of inward bowing was, according to NIST, was 55 inches. With, there's a little bit of uncertainty due to the way that this was developed by looking at a photograph, but they estimated it to be 55 inches plus or minus 6 inches. The NIST report explanation for collapse initiated propagation of the North Tower. So this is what they say about the North Tower collapse. With the continual increased bowing, as more columns buckled, the entire width of the south wall buckled. So because of this artificial force that they put on, they say that the bowing of the perimeter columns continued to increase, and as more of them buckled with that force, the entire width of the south wall buckled. So all 60 columns along that side buckled because of this force, artificial force that they put on. Instability started at the center of the south wall and rapidly progressed horizontally towards the sides. As a result of the buckling of the south wall significantly unloaded, redistributing its loads to the softened core through the hat truss and to the east and west walls through the spandrels. So, like we said earlier, the loads were redistributed, but as John Skilling stated, the redundancy of the system and the factors of safety used, these core columns could accommodate that type of load. It had a factor of safety of 3. It mentions a hat truss here, which we'll get into a second. The hat truss was what supported the North Tower's antenna on top and upper floors. So we'll get into that in a second. But 2 minutes before the collapse, the north, east, and west walls, NIST goes on to say, 2 minutes before the collapse, the north, east, and west walls at floor 98 carried about 7%, 35%, and 30% more gravity loads than it did right after impact, and the south wall carried about 7% and the core 20% less loads. So remember the factor of safeties. The perimeter columns were designed to take 500% more load than what they expected to experience. And right here it's saying that they only carried 7, 35, and 30% more. So the redistribution of load claim that they say, caused the collapse, it's not supported by the design of the structure. The section above the impact zone tilted to the south as column instability progressed rapidly from the south wall to the east and west walls, resulting in increased gravity load on the core columns. The release of potential energy due to downward movement of building mass above the buckled columns exceeded the strain energy that could be absorbed by the structure. Global collapse ensued. So this is where you get into a little bit of the progressive collapse theory. The problems with this NIST report explanation for the collapse, initiation, and propagation. There's no evidence or basis for the claim that sagging trusses could uphold the south wall of the North Tower. So because they applied this artificial force of 5,000 pounds at every truss column connection, they were able to get it, but that load is not reality. So this wasn't observed in reality based on the footage. Like it says, the NIST model did not generate the loads on the south wall columns needed to pull them inward. NIST applied artificial loads to the columns with the claim that it was necessary to match the photographic evidence. With a factor of safety of 5, the load increase to the east and west walls of 35 and 30% respectively would only increase the demand on those columns to about 27% of their capacity. So there's no reason to expect them to fail. NIST simply assumes a horizontal propagation across the building. NIST simply assumes global vertical collapse would ensue, and that relies on a paper by Northwestern University professor Zdenek Bazant for an explanation of vertical collapse propagation. The video evidence shows the core columns are what actually collapsed first. So here we'll see a video of the collapse of the North Tower. And what's important to watch in these videos is that the antenna appears to be what starts to fall first before the outside perimeter column. So let's take a look.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
So you can see here in these various frames from that same video, we're going to show 3 different frames here, but you can see that the antenna, it's shown in the middle of the photo, is what actually moves before the rest of the structure, indicating that the core columns are what failed first, which actually contradicts what NIST claims as the perimeter columns along the south wall failing horizontally and then vertical collapse ensuing after that. So let's look at these frames. You can see here in frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, the frame 3 shows the biggest drop in the vertical of the tower before anything else of the buildings moved. So the FEMA report claimed that the core columns failed first. So like I said last week, so there were a number of reports that were issued. FEMA released a report in 2002 of their analysis of the structural collapse, and what they claim is that the core columns were failed first in the North Tower. This contradicts what NIST claims, being that the perimeter columns are what failed first. So FEMA says the transmission tower on top of the structure began to move downward and laterally slightly before movement was evidenced at the exterior wall. So these two government agencies don't even agree with each other, which isn't surprising. This suggests that the collapse began with one or more failures in the central core area of the building. Again, that's from the FEMA World Trade Center Building Performance Study. So let's talk about this hat truss, because we saw in the previous video and the frames that we showed of the North Tower of the antenna failing first, indicating that core columns were taken out. We need to go over the design of that. So at the top of the North Tower, there's what this called this hat truss, which basically consisted of this truss layout that looked like a hat. The hat truss served to transfer vertical and lateral loads between the perimeter columns and the core columns. But both the video evidence and the FEMA analysis indicate first the core columns fail, then the hat truss and antenna descend before the perimeter columns, then the core columns pull on the floor trusses, finally the floor trusses pull in the perimeter columns, initiating complete collapse. So this, what FEMA claims and what AE 911 supports, is that the core columns were taken out first, pulling on the hat truss, which then pulls on the perimeter columns, causing global collapse to ensue straight down into its own footprint. And that can only happen one way. Complete collapse occurs with pulling of perimeter columns. So you can see here in this photo, and then a looping video, which I'll show, is that you can see here that the perimeter columns are what's being pulled in first. You can see that. So they didn't, and you can see along both faces that each perimeter column is being pulled in. It's not one face that propagates outward horizontally and then causes the rest. They're occurring simultaneously together as if they were detonated, the core columns, and then pulling on the perimeter columns all at the same time. The core columns pull on the floor trusses, then the floor trusses pull in the perimeter columns, initiating collapse, which you can see here in this little schematic. So if the core columns are taken out first, you can see that the floor trusses are going to pull on the perimeter columns, which is what we just saw in the video on the previous slide, which makes more sense than what NIST claims. So let's go over this progressive collapse theory, which NIST supports and which is defended by ASCE. So this is the evolution of the progressive collapse theory. So on 9/13/2001, September 13th, 2001, 2 days after the attack, civil engineering professor Zdenek Bazan of Northwestern University submits the progressive collapse theory to ASCE. The ASCE published the progressive collapse in the article, "Why Did the World Trade Center Collapse?" In the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. So ASCE is one of the largest, it is the largest civil engineering organization in the United States. And it has a number of different publications that it releases, including the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. And so this is a journal which I'm subscribed to personally, which I get, which I read. I'm an ASCE member as well. And they published this article in there where Bazan claimed a large dynamic load would have occurred, causing by what he termed a powerful jolt, and that it would have overcome the reserve strength in the columns below. So that was done in January of 2002. So 4 months after the attack or the event, they released this article claiming that this progressive collapse theory is what caused the the vertical collapse of the structure. After various questions were raised about this theory, Besant and Lee, his co-author, defended it in an article, What Did and Did Not Cause Collapse of the World Trade Center, published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in October 2008. So for 6 years, 6+ years, this was being questioned by various engineers throughout the country, various physicians, physics professors and stuff like David Chandler about the progressive collapse theory. And so they responded to those criticisms in this article. So a brief description of what the progressive collapse theory is. Professor Besant used an energy analysis to construct his progressive collapse theory. And this equation that we're going to talk about, it's real, it can occur, it's a real physics, but the assumptions that he made on the loading and the amount of energy was just wrong. So the progressive collapse theory is a mathematical model used to describe what happened when the North and South Towers collapsed. It claims that the kinetic energy of the upper part of the building when it fell onto the lower part of the building, so kinetic energy being the movement, the moving energy, the moving mass, E equals mc squared, mass, was greater than the resistance of the buckling, 3 elements: the resisting of the buckling columns that failed in the collapse initiation zone, the inertial resistance of the structure in the building below the initial initiation zone, and the structural resistance of the columns in the building below the initiation zone. In a mathematical notation, this is what it reads. So E1 being the kinetic energy of the moving of the mass of the building falling down. E2 is the sum of the resistance to buckling of columns in the initiation zone. E3 is the conservation of momentum of the upper story of the lower part being hit by the falling part. And then E4 is the sum of resistance to collapse of columns in the lower part. So like we said, this structure was designed to be very redundant. I mean, the perimeter columns were spaced at 3 feet. There were 47 columns in the inner core. There was trusses at 87 inches or at 80 inches on center with bridging trusses between them. The redundancy in this structure was just incredible. So as we'll see, it provided a lot of resistance to any sort of jolt that would have occurred. Newton's third law of physics: for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So a portion of the upper stories falling on, again, I have to point this out again. So the planes hit at the top of the building. In what world does it make sense that there was 20 floors can take out 95 floors, where the 95 floors had progressively thicker columns than what was even in the upper stories of this building? So it just doesn't make any sense, because the opposite reaction from the floors on the columns beneath the falling mass up at the top would have resisted this just by physics. So this was, again, the acceleration of the roof line of World Trade Center Building 1. And this shows that there was, so the measurement of the fall of World Trade Center Building 1 was made by David Chandler, who's a physics professor or teacher, in late 2008, showing continuous acceleration about 2/3 of gravity with no deceleration, which is needed for load amplification observed over time. So if the progressive collapse theory is true, E4 in that equation that I just showed you, there would have been some deceleration of the mass falling, because as any engineer knows, even after a column buckles, there's still some resistance left. So because there was continuous acceleration about 2/3 of gravity and no deceleration, you could say that there was just no resistance left at all. Which is not reality. Going back to the evolution of the progressive collapse. So we, Besant and Lee responded to criticisms in 2008 that they received within the 6 years of writing their initial paper that was published by the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. So in 2009, McQueen and Zambodi published The Missing Jolt, a simple refutation of NIST Besant collapse hypothesis on the website Journal of 9/11 studies in 2009. And then David Chandler published Destruction of the World Trade Center Tower and Fundamental Physics on the website Journal of 9/11 Studies in 2010. So all of this, the acceleration models that I just showed you, and then the free fall collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, which I showed you guys last week, that was published in 2010 with David Chandler's paper. So because of these two papers, Besant and Lee decided that they needed to defend their theory again in a paper, Why the Observed Motion History of the World Trade Center Towers is Smooth. So, McQueen and Zambodi challenged Besant and Lee in their paper by saying that there was not a jolt that could have happened there. It just wasn't observed. There's no evidence for it. And so Besant and Lee again came out in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in January 2011 saying that there was smooth progressive collapse. And then Zambodi and Johns submitted a discussion paper in May 2011 to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, pointing out the errors in Besant and Lee's paper, Why the Observed Motion of the History of World Trade Centers is Smooth. 1 year later, in May 2012, Zambodi and Johns were notified that the Journal of Engineering Mechanics that their discussion paper was rejected on the basis of just one reviewer's comments. Zambodi and Johns immediately responded to the rejection with rebuttals showing that the rejection was unjustified as the reviewer was wrong on almost all points. The GEM, Journal of Engineering Mechanic editors, responded by agreeing to publish the discussion paper after an editorial review. Another year passed and they didn't hear anything, so Zambodi and Johns sent a letter to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in May 2013 inquiring about the status of their paper. Then 3 months later, in August of 2013, the Journal of Engineering chief editor Casper William and Robert Ballerini responded that the discussion paper was out of scope and would not be published. And this is just absurd. It's a discussion paper on an existing article. That doesn't make sense on why it's out of scope. They just didn't want to have their narrative questioned. While the above was occurring, Zambodi and Johns joined with Zelinsky in writing a full technical note addressing all 4 of the Besant World Trade Center papers that the Journal of Engineering Mechanics had published. It was submitted to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in May 2012 and was rejected by after a few months for being out of scope with no further explanation. They resubmitted it to the International Journal of Protective Structures, where it was published in June 2013. So the problem with Besant's theories, which Zambodi and Johns and others lay out, is the maximum design load was used for, for E1, which was the kinetic energy of the falling mass. The maximum design load was used for the mass of the upper part of the building above the initiation zone. It was nearly twice the actual in-service load shown in published reports. He used 54 kilograms, and the in-service load was actually 33 million kilograms. The velocity after a fall of 1 story due to gravitational acceleration of 8.5 meters per second was used, while actual measurements show it to be 6.1 meters per second. Because the velocity is squared in the kinetic energy equation, E equals mc squared, this doubles the contribution. Due to his nearly doubling the mass and velocity contributions to the kinetic energy, E1 was too high by a factor of almost 4. So the amount of force that E2, E3, and E4 needed to resist was 4 times what it actually was. The problem with his E2, the fall through the initiation zone, did not account for buckling resistance, which he eliminated completely. Thus, E2 was reduced to 0. So in the initiation zone, Besant claimed that there was no buckling resistance to the structure after they were impacted, which is just crazy because we know that even if steel is heated or it expands, it fails or buckles, it still has resistance of some sort. So the conservation of momentum calculation for E3 he used only 627,000 kilograms mass for the story below, or about 14% of the 3.87 million kilograms he used for the stories in his 14-story, 554 million kilogram upper section. So he was using different masses for the different floors, when in fact you're actually getting heavier as you go down and lighter as you go up. So thus E3 was too low by a factor of 7. The estimate of the resistance of the columns in the lower part of the building was only about 31% of what it actually can be shown to be. Thus, E4 was too low by a factor of 3. So essentially, he basically reduced all of the resistance factors and upped the kinetic energy that was applied to them, causing, verifying his progressive collapse theory. Thus, E1 is less than E2 plus the E3 plus E4, and the progressive collapse will not occur. But the input data he used is incorrect. So here you can see that this Besant theorized with the following errors: free fall acceleration through one story, used max design load upper section mass, underestimated conservation of momentum, and underestimated energy dissipation of lower columns. So you can see here in the blue is what Besant's theory claims was the actual fall of the building, when Chandler can show with the dashed lines that there was actual resistance, and the solid line, that there was actual resistance of the structure. Downward movement should have been arrested after 2 seconds, calculated if collapse was natural with actual acceleration through one story, actual in-service load, upper mass, a section mass, correct conservation of momentum. So what the solid line is showing is that based on the design that John Skilling used, with factors of safety of 5 for the perimeter columns and 3 for the core columns, the redistribution of load would have stopped the progressive collapse after 2 seconds because of the strength of those members. In a gravitational collapse, you would see the top 12 stories relatively intact during collapse, but that's not what we see here. You can see in this photograph that the top 12 stories, which Zdeněk Besant claims caused this progressive collapse by, such a huge amount of kinetic energy falling on the bottom floors, it's basically disintegrated in this photo. So it wasn't even there to fall. Much of the materials landed outside of the tower's footprint. You can see here that the primary debris field was at least 1,200 feet. So the 12 upper stories were not intact enough to even cause the progressive collapse theory to ensue. Half of the 12 stories disintegrate in 3 seconds before any collapse occurs below. So you can see here that half of those 12 stories are just completely gone before it even hits the lower part of the building. You can see in this photo, collapse is symmetric for the first several seconds. Note the smoke coming out evenly on all sides and front of the building as the collapse initiates at the 98th floor. You can see the tower again falling down first. South tower onset of destruction. The collapse is advanced evenly and progressing in a straight line around the building. How could symmetrical progression occur due to asymmetrical damage? So like I showed you, and what's shown on the bottom right of the screen is an asymmetrical entrance of the building, yet the building fell down symmetrically within its own footprint. So like I stated earlier, no other high-rise buildings have failed due to fire. We have many examples of this. A 62-story building in Los Angeles burned for a number of hours over 5 floors, didn't fall. Philadelphia, 1991, 38-story building burned for 18 hours over 8 floors, didn't fall. Caracas, Venezuela, 56-story building burned for 17 hours over 26 floors, still standing. Structural steel from the so we're getting into the destruction of evidence. Structural steel from the World Trade Center has been and continues to be cut up and sold for scrap. This is Bill Manning, the editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine. He demanded a stop to the destruction of evidence. Such destruction of evidence shows the astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of thorough scientific investigation. What did they have to show? Of the materials that were collected, however, there seems to be evidence of more than just fire on the steel. Very little effort was made to preserve the evidence related to the unprecedented collapse of these three buildings, easily the three largest and most perplexing structural failures in history.
When did you become aware that the steel from the World Trade Center was being sold off?
I think it was on the order of a week or so before we arrived on site on October the 5th, I believe it was.
So in other words, the city was selling or was disposing of material within 2 weeks of the actual event?
I believe I was the first one to find out that the steel is being recycled. New York Times reporter Jim Glantz told me 2 weeks after the collapse, and I tried to contact city and also New York Times reporters tried to make sure we can have access to steel to do the research. It was not happening.
I just think there's so much that's been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And for the American Society of Civil Engineers to ignore those events is extremely disturbing and is a violation, in my opinion, of their professional code of ethics.
It was contrary to the way all investigations are done. If an airplane crashes, they seal off the entire area, nobody touches anything, they move it to a secure location, and they reconstruct an aircraft.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
So it was the destruction of evidence was just astounding. They didn't keep anything. I'm going to go through this quickly. There were hot spots, surface temperatures which exceeded very high temperatures. The official reports by NIST, FEMA, the 9/11 Commission omit any mention of large quantities of molten metal observed in the basement areas of the Twin Towers. Summary of the problems, wrapping up here. The claim that the upper part of the towers crushed the lower part of the towers violates the law of construction of momentum and the law that for every action between bodies, there's an equal and opposite reaction, as shown by the measured smooth, uninterrupted descent of the upper portion of the North Tower. NIST claims that the floor trusses in the aircraft impact zone push outward on the perimeter columns with a force of about 80 kips before starting to sag and pull the columns inward to cause the buildings to collapse. Yet there is no evidence to support this claim. Extensive photos and videos of the tower should show no outward bowing of the perimeter columns. NIST imposed an unrealistic artificial 5-kip force on each floor truss to column connection over the 5 stories for a total of 750 kips applied artificially to that face of the building, which cannot be justified by any rationale. NIST does not investigate or explain the global collapse, which occurred after the collapse initiation was supposedly initiated by the column failures in the impact zone. NIST simply states global collapse ensued. The NIST collapse sequence is initiated by the failure of the floor trusses and impact zone and subsequent pulling of the perimeter columns. But the sequence ignores the fact that the core columns failed first, as evidenced by the videos. The NIST report fails to provide any information suggesting that the load capacity of the core and perimeter columns was exceeded at any time during the collapse sequence. NIST ignored the fact that the factor of safety of 3 in the core columns and 5 in the perimeter columns would have prevented the failure mechanism that is theorized in their collapse initiation model. The NIST global collapse theory depends upon ASCE published progressive collapse by Zdenek Bazant. His theory has been shown to have erroneous input data, rendering it non-viable as an explanation for the observed behavior of the vertical propagation. So the deficiency categories: defective collapse initiation theories in the NIST Twin Tower and World Trade Center reports. Second, unjustified assumptions and errors. Third, omissions and alterations of construction details in the NIST report. Fourth, errors in the calculations of the ASCE published theories. Fifth, internal contradictions in their own reports. Sixth, NIST ignores FEMA evidence of high temperature exposure of structural steel. Seventh, NIST and ASCE refuse to respond to peer criticism. So with that, Andy, I'll bring you back on and we can answer any questions.
All right, great job there. So I just want to remind any engineers who may have been watching this to go get your credit for doing so. Go to ae911truth.org/CPD. That's our continuing professional development page. Just give us your information, including your email, take the quiz, and we will send you a certificate. So we have 2 questions, and they're really just comments that I'm going to have you take on here. The first one is from someone who doesn't seem to agree with us. It says very boldly here, the planes didn't knock the buildings over. They stood afterwards, consistent with those predictions. The heat of the jet fuel fed fires softened the steel. And that's the end. Now, I know you just spent an hour debunking all of that, but in very short terms here, can you just address that statement?
Yeah, I think, well, it's evidence that the impact from the planes did not cause the collapse of the buildings. You can see from video evidence that the core columns are what failed first, pulling the perimeter columns inward and causing symmetrical global collapse. There was no, if jet fuel was to burn and melt the steel like it did, the buildings would have tilted and fallen over at an asymmetrical way of fashion. So I'm not sure that. And then there's also the NIST reports in their own study that most of the jet fuel was burned up within a few minutes of the impact of the plane. So there's no way that jet fuel could have burned through the steel and caused it to do all of what it did.
That's right. Now, here's one that I just saw, and maybe you can address this. It's an interesting point. It says, compare the size of a plane's fuel tank with the size of a tower, since the fuel tanks are only a tiny part of the planes, and the planes are tiny compared to the buildings.
Yeah,
what do you think of that argument?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, in that, you know, the amount of fuel that was on these, I mean, you have to think about it. Each floor of these 110-story tall skyscrapers was an acre in size. Now, when you look at an airplane, its fuel container maybe takes up a tenth, you know, conservatively of that. So the amount of fuel that was on each of these acre area floors, just it couldn't have been enough. And the size of the plane, like Charlie Thornton pointed out, and John Skilling even said it wouldn't have been remotely close to enough force to cause these buildings to collapse.
Right. And we have a point coming in from one of our great volunteers I just see here. It says, remember, too, that the upper sections of building were much lighter and weaker than the sections below. This means that the upper sections would have crushed and destroyed themselves first. So that's what we have for questions this week, or comments and such. But if you guys watch this later on and you have further questions, you can always write to us at ae911truth.org, and we're always happy to answer them. But Seth, thank you so much. And I just want to let our audience know we are going to be back next month with a new presenter. I'm not going to tell you who it is yet, but you will be finding out. And we'll be starting again with World Trade Center 7 in September. So thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.